Yoga teachers want to keep your classes fresh without teaching arm balances or inversions. In this video, I'll be sharing one method for easily adding creativity to your Vinyasa flow classes. If you haven't already, hit the subscription button and the notification bell to be notified every single time I release a new video sharing yoga teaching tips. Before we dive in on how to add creativity to a Vinyasa flow class, let's review the sequencing structure for a Vinyasa flow class. I have this for free inside of my Yoga Sequencing Made Easy ebook. You can download it in the description down below. So in a Vinyasa flow class, we always start with our grounding and tune-in. This is about the first 5 to 7 minutes of class. During the grounding and tune-in, it consists of 3 things: getting your student present, teaching a breathing technique, setting an intention for your class, and theming your yoga class. After that, we move into the warm-up. The warm-up is about the first 10 minutes of class, and this is where it's really important to move the spine in the 6 directions. The 6 directions of the spine are flexion and extension, that cat and cow movement, then twisting in both directions and side bending in both directions. After that, you move into sequence 1, which is about 10 minutes. Then you move into sun salutation A. I like to teach 3 of them. That is about 5 minutes. Then you move into sequence 2, which is about 15 minutes. This is where you teach your peak pose and you incorporate standing poses and balancing poses. Then you move into the cool down, which is about 10 minutes. This is where you teach forward folds and back bends. And then you move into Shavasana, which is about 3 to 5 minutes. There are many different ways to add creativity to a Vinyasa flow class. One way is by adding a physical theme to your yoga class, and I taught this on my How to Add Creativity to a Beginner Yoga class. So you can check that video to learn that method. You also could add creativity by changing the orientation on the mat, meaning moving sideways on the mat or to the back of the mat, or moving all the way around your mat, or teaching a creative variation of your peak pose. I taught exactly how to do that in my video on creative sequencing for all levels or slow flow classes. Now in this video, I'm going to be teaching you a new method on exactly how to add creativity to a Vinyasa flow class. So let's get into it. You can discover your own tricky transitions to spice up your flows. My method for creating your own tricky transitions is simple. Get into the pose and see how you can play and move. Let's try it. Come onto your yoga mat and come into a seated forward fold. So the first question is, what other seated poses can we easily come into from here? So we could easily come into like a butterfly pose. We could easily come into a seated tree pose. We could easily come into a one leg straight, one leg bent pose. We could easily come into a half Lord of the Fishes. We easily can come into a cow face pose. So we got a lot of other seated poses that we can smoothly transition to. So now that we know all of the seated poses that we can get into, let's see if we can find some of those other, what I like to call tricky transitions. And the best way to do that is by asking ourselves some questions. So let's start with our arms. If I move my arms forward and then lift in my hips, can't really do that. So that one doesn't work. Does that allow me to come into a pose? Part of this is play and trying things, and some things are going to work and some things are not going to work. Now let's walk our hands sideways. Let's move them like all the way sideways in line with our hips and then lift our hips. Does that allow us to come into another pose? That was a very weird pose, but we could probably play something there with that. It kind of lets us, if we like keep our legs straight, lift our hips, and then bend our knees, we actually could pretty easily transition to the back of the mat in a tabletop position. So that might be one fun transition to play with. So that's if we moved our hands sideways. Now, what if we moved our arms behind us? We can easily come into our reverse plank. What if we moved our arms behind us in the other way and lifted our hips? What if we just moved one arm behind us and then lifted our hips? We can come into a side plank here. You could even do that and come into like a modified side plank as well. So that's definitely a fun transition we could get into. Now let's try some other things. Where else could we move our arms? So we've got back more, and then lifting our hips. We're still here in this reverse table. We've got the other side. This definitely could be for something here. So those are all the ways we can move our arms. Now let's try our legs. If we moved our feet and our legs and then lifted our hips, would that allow us to come into another pose? So what if we just pointed our toes? Now we'll kind of have to we'd have to kind of lose this shape by bending our legs. So there's not really many places here we could keep this shape, right? I don't want to move into another seated pose. I want to keep this shape here. What other poses could we come into? Simply by moving our legs. We can't, because all we can do is point our toes, and I can't really lift our hips from here, right? That would be really hard. We could place our hands to the side and then lift our hips and then bend our knees and kind of come forward. So we could kind of combine the two. What else could we do? Sometimes it's just giving ourselves permission to play on our yoga mat and see what we can come up with. So the two that I really liked were our side plank like this, and then our hands to the side, lift your hips, and then come into tabletop facing the back of the mat. So those could definitely be two that we can incorporate into our class and tie that thread in a lot of different ways throughout class. Now, let's see if we can do those in reverse. So let's start with our side plank one. Side plank, and then sit down. We can easily come back into that. And now let's find our tabletop one. We kind of have to do this in two steps where we like straighten our legs, kind of like in a plank pose, and then sit our hips down and fold. So those are two ones that we created together. Now let's try this in a different pose. Let's come into pigeon pose on our yoga mats. You can see here I got my notes because I always use my notes for everything that I'm doing, including teaching yoga. So let's first start with what other seated poses could we smoothly transition to? So we could smoothly transition to deer here. We could smoothly transition to like a seated tree here. We could go in the other direction now and move into a seated tree this way. We could come back into our deer pose and move into like a wide-legged forward fold sideways on our mat. What other seated positions could we easily do? We could easily come into our half Lord of the Fishes. We could easily come into our cow face pose. We could even easily come into our butterfly pose. So we have a lot of smooth transitions that we could easily come into from our pigeon pose. Now let's see if we can create some of those tricky transitions. So in our pigeon pose, what standing poses now could I get to from here? If I move my legs and lift my hips, will that allow me to come into another pose? So let's try this out. If we move our back leg, where could we move our back leg, right? We could move it to the side. We can keep it bent. From here and then lifted our hips, we actually could come into a low lunge from a deer pose. That does work really hard. What else? If we had this leg straight and then lifted our hips, that was really cool. We're in this kind of funky position, but that definitely worked. We could probably do like a lot of fun stuff from here. We could like lift the leg. We could cross into the other direction. We can bring it back to lunge. So that definitely works, right? So we have the leg bent. We have the leg straight. Then we're like lifting the hips. Now, what if we take the leg forward and bent and we lift our hips up? Wow, from here, this unlocks so many things. We could do supported warrior 3. What else could we do? We could basically do almost any standing pose, right? We could come into like a lunge pose. We could open up into like a warrior 2. We could open up into, let's see if we can get into warrior 1. A warrior 1, right? So really like any standing pose by simply drawing the leg forward, lifting the hips, we could really come into any standing pose here. So that definitely works here. Now, I don't think it will work if we just keep our legs straight, right, and lift the hips. That's kind of funky. Now, what if we take our leg all the way over to the side? I mean, it brings us into a different pose, but for sure you can then lift your hips and stand up as well, right? So it's just really giving yourself permission to come into the pose, move your body parts around, lift your hips, and see what you can come up with. Now let's see if we can move the arms in any direction and lift the hips and see if that allows us to come into anything. I don't suspect it will, but we're gonna try anyway. So if we move our hands forward, we can tuck our toes. We could step it right back to plank. That definitely works. What if we kept our toes tucked, lifted our hips? We could come right into upward facing dog. That also works. What else could we do here? If we did like a thread the needle here, we could totally roll right onto our backs into a half happy baby and then roll right back around. This is really, really hard though, but it is Vinyasa flow or intermediate class. What else could we do here? What if we took our hands to the side? Can't really lift my hips from here. What else could we do? Arms forward. Can't really lift my hips from here. What if I brought my arms over here? Can't really do anything. What about arms over here? Can't really do anything. So we found a lot of fun transitions that you could definitely incorporate into your class. And you could use that one transition in a lot of different ways, or you can tie some of these other transitions throughout your flow. So this is pretty much my method for discovering your own tricky transitions. It's getting into the pose and giving yourself permission to play. Depending on if you're like in a seated pose or a standing pose, it will change like what questions that you ask yourself. So if you're in a seated pose first, I always like to start with what other seated poses can I easily move into? Or if you're in a standing pose, what other standing poses can I easily move into? And then I start just moving my arms and my legs and then lifting my hips. And I move my arms and my legs in all the different directions. And then I lift my hips and I see, does that allow me to come into something else? Part of the process is you're going to try things and it's not going to work. That's okay. And then you're going to try something and it's going to unlock something. And you're like, wow, I never thought I could do that. Or I never thought of that before. That is part of the process. So just know that. Now that we've discovered some tricky transitions, let's see if we can build some into a flow. Let's see if we can build a flow that incorporates both a seated forward fold transition and a pigeon pose transition. So let's start with our seated forward fold and let's do our transition to our side plank. And then from here, we can step it all the way forward to a high lunge. From our high lunge, let's see if we can make our way into a pigeon pose. Look at that. And from our pigeon pose, we can move smoothly into a seated pose. Look at that little flow prompt. So I'll just review that little flow that we built together. So we're in our seated forward fold. We sweep an arm behind us. We lift our hips all the way up to side plank. We step to the back of the mat, come into a high lunge. From high lunge, we're going to make our way into pigeon pose. Very unexpected. From pigeon pose, we'll move into our seated tree, sideways on the mat and fold. And then from here, look, we easily make our way back to our seated forward fold to do this whole thing here on the second side. What a fun little creative flow that has a lot of different creative elements in it. We're going from seated to standing. We're moving sideways on the mat. We're adding in some tricky transitions. So that was perfect. Let me know if this was helpful. Let me know if you're going to try this method for building your own tricky transitions and then incorporating those tricky transitions into your Vinyasa flow class. And if you absolutely love creative sequencing and you're looking for ways to add more creative sequencing to your yoga classes, I invite you to join my online creative sequencing yoga teacher training where I go way deep into all things creative sequencing. It is available now. You can get more information about it in the description down below.